meditation chime cut through the quiet of the apartment like a blade through silk. Anakin flinched, heat crawling up the back of his neck before he even opened his eyes. When he did, his mother was already watching him, amusement dancing in her gaze. "I'm sorry, I need to go," Shmi finished for him. No reproach, no guilt laid at his feet, just love, warm and steady as a sunrise. "I know. You told me before we started." He rose quickly, pulling her into an embrace. She felt smaller than memory, insisted she should be. Not small the way Leia was. Delicate, compact, a woman built for fitting into tight spaces and slipping through cracks, but smaller than the towering figure of his childhood. The woman who had once been his entire sky, soft and vast and safe. Now her head barely reached his chest. "We didn't get enough practice in," he murmured into her hair. She kissed his cheek. "I'll continue with Leia. I won't progress quickly, but I want to help however I can." That was his mother, always reaching for something new if it meant shielding the people she loved. Teaching her had been stranger than realizing he'd grown taller than her, stranger than feeling the Force move through her like water finding its level. But meditating beside her had become the calmest part of his days. He could feel her confidence growing, session by session, and he worried about leaving her here on Coruscant alone while he went back to war. "You'll come again tomorrow?" she asked. He couldn't meet her eyes. "I can't." The words landed between them like stones dropped into still water. He saw her expression shift, not hurt, never hurt, but understanding. The same look she'd worn the day he begged her to let him go to the Jedi, forgiveness without being asked. "You received your new assignment," she said. Not a question. "Good. Obi-Wan needs you back." I didn't say it was Obi-Wan. Her grin told him she already knew. Of course she did. She still read him like open text even after all these years apart, even after everything. The door slid open before he could protest further. One of Padme's handmaidens, Erte, he thought, though the names still blurred together, stepped in with a slight bow. "Apologies, Master Skywalker. The Senator needs your mother. We're preparing for this morning's meeting." "We just finished." Shmi stepped to Anakin's side, kissed his cheek again. "Will I see you before you go? I leave today." He hadn't meant to say it so bluntly, but it was his mother. She deserved the truth. "This is it. Until we're called back. Or until Leia trains me for the work she's been doing." Shmi's tone shifted, lighter now, almost sly. "I think I've reached the limits of my usefulness on this planet. I expect I'll be assigned to start traveling with the refugee transports. Who knows how often our paths might cross." She was smiling. Hopeful, mischievous even. None of the careful blankness he remembered from the day she'd first let him go. Concern was there, yes, but also confidence. Also that warm, gentle love he'd always anchored himself to. He kissed her forehead. "Just try to get into less trouble than Leia." "Not a very hard mark," Shmi said, following Airtight toward the door. "Everyone gets into less trouble than Leia." Slander. The word came from the couch, dry and flat. Leia didn't look up from her datapad. "And from my own family." Padme was already dressed for the Senate, dark blue fabric catching the light as she moved. Beautiful in that effortless way that made Anakin feel gawky and underdressed. "Name one person, just one who's been in more trouble than you since you've been here." "Obi-Wan." No hesitation. "You. I was not." Airtight coughed, something that sounded suspiciously like the word assassin. Padme glared. "I still wasn't in as much trouble as Leia has been, if we're talking cumulative trouble." Leia finally looked up. Her smile was thin, tired, a little sad in a way that made Anakin's chest tighten. "Then yes, I definitely win. I've been in more trouble in half my life than you've managed in all of yours." The words landed heavier than their teasing tone suggested. Anakin felt the truth of them like a physical weight. He'd been with Leia during some of her worst moments, watched her face a fallen Jedi Master with nothing but sharp words and sharper instinct. She wasn't exaggerating. and he was leaving. Shmi's palm pressed flat between his shoulder blades. Reassurance poured through him, deliberate and warm. Their training together was already paying dividends. "Relax," Leia drawled from the couch, one arm slung over the back. "I'm exceptionally resilient. I've made it this far, haven't I? By yourself?" He regretted them instantly when something in her face went still, frozen for just a heartbeat. "Of course not." She shrugged, and the mask was back in place. "That's what I have all of you for, isn't it? Damn it." How did he keep doing that? Walking straight into the wounded places, even when he knew they were there, even when he knew what they cost her. He never had this problem with Obi-Wan or his mother. He knew what made them sad, knew how to step around it. When had he gotten so bad at this? A second chime sounded. Time was up. Anakin grabbed a half hug from his mother, bowed to the women in the room. "Thank you for letting us borrow your space. Good luck with your work." He knew his mother was still helping with legislation for the brothers, helping refugees find their footing. And Padme and Leia were buried in something about harvesting battle droids, which sounded troublingly dangerous, so it was probably Leia's idea. And other projects he only half understood when he overheard them talking. "Will you be here this early tomorrow?" Padme asked. "We'd love to have you for breakfast." No. Sorry, I won't." He floundered. "That's Jedi business?" Leia supplied. Not surprised, not especially interested. He nodded. "That's too bad. Just let us know when you're free next and we'll figure something out. It might be a while." He'd only been back for his knighting. And now he was a general with a battalion under his command. The weight of that hadn't settled yet. Probably never would. "Then we'll wait." Leia's expression was completely serious for a moment before it slipped into a smirk. "Unless you don't want to come?" "I do." Laughter rippled through the room. His mother patted his back. "We know. And we'll look forward to it." "Take care," Padme said. He bowed to her one more time. "Let us know if there's anything we can do." "I will." He meant it. He'd have to see if Leia could teach him how to set up a secure channel. Maybe she'd taught Obi-Wan. "Fly safe," she called as the lift opened. Anakin waved without turning around, smiling despite everything. He wondered how often her brother had heard those words. The heat on Radnor was a living thing. It pressed against Obi-Wan's skin, crawled into his robes, settled in his bones like an unwelcome guest. He muttered something under his breath that he hoped the Force wouldn't carry too far. Cody snorted beside him. "You don't say, sir." The armor had to make it worse. Obi-Wan knew they wanted him in some. He'd conceded to try pieces of it. They were waiting for Anakin to bring the rest back with him. General Skywalker. The title still sent a strange shiver through him, even in this heat. Cody watched him for a long moment. Then, quietly, "He'll be all right. The 501st is staying with us for now. You have plenty of time to finish getting him trained up, and we'll help." It wasn't that. Obi-Wan stared out over the orange and white landscape, squinting against the glare. "They don't teach us how to train them." He didn't say the rest. "Or how to let them go. And no one trained us for this." Cody's voice was level, matter of fact, but the admission stung given how much trust his men had placed in him. Obi-Wan swallowed around the fear, the certainty that he wasn't enough. He was making this up as he went, all of them were, and it had been easy so far. They'd been on the edge of conflict, not in the middle of it. Christophsis had been a nightmare, if Master Windu's terse reports were anything to go by, and Ryloth was still unfolding into something bloody and long. If Anakin succeeded here, what were the odds he'd be sent there next? "Leia did," Cody said, cutting through the haze. The disdain in his voice was as sharp as ever. "Makes you wonder who taught her. Experience, I would expect." Obi-Wan spoke slowly, watching the horizon to avoid the irritation he could feel radiating from his commander. "And she certainly did the best she could with us, but I wouldn't call it anything as formal as training." Then Cody asked the question that had been building between them for weeks. "Why do you trust her so much?" It wasn't the first time Cody had asked, but something was different this time. A desperate edge, a search for reassurance that hadn't been there before. Exposure seemed to have worsened Cody's view of Leia rather than improved it. But to answer... Darkness. Not in his eyes. All around him, pressing against his mind, seeping into his heart. His failures spinning through memory, his inadequacies, the promise of power if he would just let go. You didn't give up. He still couldn't grasp how she'd known. Leia wasn't a Jedi. Wasn't trained in the Force in any appreciable way. Falling wasn't something that should have occurred to her, shouldn't have presented itself as an option for what had been Obi-Wan's greatest fear. But she'd seen it. Exposed it. Without being distracted by anything else. As if she'd known in her bones what it was like to fight that kind of darkness. How crucial it was that they hadn't given up. Even his mind healer hadn't managed to grasp it. They'd talked about the torture, the feelings of inadequacy and hopelessness, the fear during the escape. How he'd worried that his almost stranger of a Padawan and this woman he barely knew would be captured, hurt, killed. But they'd never discussed how close Obi-Wan had come to reaching out with his anger. His pain, his desperation, scrambling for power, enough power to flee, to escape, to kill. Leia had known, viscerally, instinctively, as if she'd lived it herself. He tilted his head back, shielding his eyes. I understand her. I don't agree with everything she does, with the risks she's willing to take, but I understand being desperate. Wanting to protect something so badly you stop seeing the consequences as you decide what actions to take. Cody huffed. Not a problem you have, sir. Obi-Wan chuckled. Oh, you just missed the worst of it. You should have seen me when I started training Anakin. I didn't have a clue what I was doing, and Qui-Gon. They couldn't finish the thought. Couldn't remember if Cody knew who Obi-Wan's master had been. I couldn't fail them. I couldn't imagine the consequences. He shook his head. You're lucky you missed that. Their break was over. Gregor was coming with the last patrol reports, and Obi-Wan wasn't going to waste a chance to read those inside where it was moderately cool. You're doing well, Cody said, before Gregor had quite reached them. Obi-Wan started a little. However bad it was then. You take care of us. You keep your eyes open. And then, with a grin, just let us watch your back. We'll let you know if you pick up any bad habits. Oh. I have every confidence of that. The morning light in Padme's apartment was thin and artificial, filtering through transparent steel that showed nothing but the endless vertical sprawl of Coruscant. Bail. Organa sat at the conference table, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his beard catching the pale glow. He had been quiet for 7 minutes. Padme had counted. Under a minute meant he was organizing his thoughts. 2 minutes meant he was constructing an argument. 7 minutes meant he was simply worried. Senator Organa, he said softly from across the table. Her voice carried a weight that made it impossible to ignore, gentle as it was. Bale looked up, apologetic. I don't see a neat way out of this. We don't need a way out. We need a way through. Shmi's confidence had grown in the months since she'd arrived on Coruscant, but it had never lost its quiet, deliberate quality. And no, it will not be neat. But it is necessary. I wanted it to be neat, Bale said, shaking his head. I wanted all of this resolved quickly. The silence that followed was heavy. Shmi let it sit for a moment before she spoke again, her voice dropping into a register that made Padme think of desert winds and long, patient years. In my experience, quick solutions are never neat. They are vicious and bloody. I don't recommend them. Bale steepled his hands together, bowing his head slightly. You're right. I'm sorry. It was the apology that made Shmi uncomfortable, Padme noticed. Not the disagreement, she interjected quickly. So we're doing this? Oh yes, Bale answered, rubbing his forehead. We'll need to present all 3 versions of the bill and allow them to the floor for debate. The results we got from the clones weren't conclusive enough for us to come to a decision. We'll need to see how the Republic reacts to choices. Padme felt the sobering weight of that word settle over the room. Choices. As if the men and women in white armor had ever truly been given one. Do we have a preference? She asked. She did. Or rather, she had one she didn't prefer. Making all the clones citizens of Coruscant didn't strike her as the correct solution. Coruscant was the center of the Republic, governed not by an elected senator, but by the Chancellor's representation. A gross oversight, Padme thought, though probably one that had started with good intentions. Because it held the Senate, Coruscant's population represented displaced people from across the galaxy. Surely if the Chancellor was elected by galactic vote, they were also the best option for planetary representative. In practice, Padme couldn't think of a single thing Chancellor Valorum or Palpatine had done that represented Coruscant's desires. As far as she was aware, no one even collected those opinions. The most democratic choice would be to allow planets and systems to volunteer, Bale said. Unfortunately, we have no way then of guaranteeing quality of life or rights. And I wouldn't be surprised if a number of systems tried to use the citizenship to recall parts of the army to their own planets for safety, and continue to keep the clones as a personal military afterward. We can write the legislation to counter that, Padme pointed out, but Shmi was shaking her head. Only to a limited extent. The clones have no recourse if the rules are bent or broken, and most of them wouldn't know to object. They've been raised to live like this. It might be familiar and comfortable. And we wouldn't want to prevent them from being folded into local militaries and security forces, Bale agreed. Those are valuable skills, and if they're being appropriately compensated, we might have at least a holdover solution to our lack of organized military. We don't lack that, Shmi said. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it that Padme had learned to recognize. That is the entirety of the problem. I meant once the war is over, Bale clarified. Which is when the citizenship will matter most. Padme drummed her fingers against her datapad. The question that had been building in her chest for weeks finally pushed its way out. Is it? Both her companions turned to look at her. We're already starting to lose people to the argument that the Separatists are using a droid army, Padme said. That it's more ethical. That it shows they were concerned about defense more than attack. Lies. But they're still saying it. It's not just an issue of offering identification or pay. It's about our standards, that we aren't forcing people into our army or the Republic, that they're welcome, but they don't need to feel threatened by us. This was the thing that had come to bother Padme after months of arguing and deliberation. What had lurked in the back of her mind as she had adamantly opposed the Military Creation Act and raged when she discovered the existence of the clones. How could the Republic be free if they dragged the Confederacy back into it by force? When Leia and Anakin and Obi-Wan had discovered the droid army, how comprehensively had they lost that choice? Don't they? Shmi asked, her voice coaxing Padme from her thoughts back to the present. Would the Republic have stood for anything less than reintegration? Not just the Republic, Padme realized as Shmi held her gaze. Would Padme have stood for allowing the Separatists to stay separated? To be another power, another organized force at work in the galaxy? In all her preparation and negotiation, in all her diplomacy, had Padme ever said she would acknowledge the systems if they didn't come back? Had any of the loyalists? They hadn't, she realized. A sensation like ice pouring down her spine made her shiver. For all their diversity of opinions, the one constant in the committee was that they all believed, without exception, that the correct solution was to reintegrate the lost systems back into the Republic. But was that necessary? Was it wise? The Confederacy was organized by a Sith Lord, Bale pointed out. It may look benign, but its existence is anathema to everything that the Republic stands for. No, it isn't, Padme found herself saying. She blushed when Bale's attention whipped to her. I mean, the Count's is. The Sith are. But if the Confederacy had leadership that wasn't tainted, it wasn't that different from the Republic, aside from business conglomerations not having representation. and Padme had no objections to that. Perhaps we should stay away from hypotheticals, Shmi suggested, looking between Bail and Padme. However it happened, the Republic has an army of sentients deployed, unrepresented by any protective government authority. This damages the Republic's stance against slavery, and, in some cases, against the Separatists. They could let the Hutts in, Padme said. The thought burst through her and out her mouth before she could stop it. The Hutts could argue that the existence of the clone army proves exceptions on the Republic's stance, and they deserve a seat. And if they got it, Shmi's voice was somewhere between fury and horror, they could volunteer to take some of the clones. A breath of silence. Then Bail stood, moving to his desk. Which representatives do we know that are firmly anti-Hutt? Across the city, in a small office that smelled faintly of recycled air and determination, Leia Skywalker sat at her desk and tried to ignore the way her hands wanted to tremble. Senator Darsana had settled into the seat across from her without invitation, his long fingers steepled in a gesture she was beginning to recognize as his thinking posture. "You're not breathing properly," he observed. Leia glanced up, forcing a grimace that she hoped looked more exasperated than rattled. "How could you possibly have come to that conclusion?" "The air currents. They're harder to read than water, but I'm familiar with yours." "Well, that was disconcerting. This is going less smoothly than I imagined," she confessed, twitching her fingers to indicate the mess of hair she'd been trying to tame. That morning, Sabe had asked how she'd done her braids with such appreciative curiosity that Leia had realized too late she'd let her hands move on their own, winding her hair up into a series of simple, looped braids that were all Alderaanian. She'd escaped with a quick promise to teach Sabe later, which was a painful lie, because this had been one of Leia's favorite styles precisely because it stayed in so well. "Most likely frustration," Darsana said, a hint of a grin crossing his angular features. He waved a casual hand at his own smooth head. "Not a problem I'm familiar with." "Naturally," Leia said, finishing the last pin and patting her head to test for obvious failures. "What can I do for you?" The best way to avoid awkwardness was to ignore it and offer a distraction. Luckily, the senator was willing to follow along. "I hear you and Senator Satashasa are responsible for the original framework for the droid harvesting program. Not just the voices for the final presentation," he added dryly before Leia could quip about him having been at the meeting. "I'm wondering why you're so interested in the project." One he had been sitting on if he was only coming to her now with it. Either something had changed, or he had been waiting for some ideal opportunity. And he wasn't going to be satisfied with a simple answer if Leia was reading him correctly. But it was worth a try. "I saw a need, and I happen to know the right people to possibly address it." "Happened?" Senator Darsana challenged, his mouth not quite closing as he spoke. "A need? I like puzzles," Leia suggested with a half smile. She earned a sharp grin, but couldn't escape so easily. "I'm sure you do. But surely you are aware how acutely fortuitous your presence here has been." It was easier than she had expected to slip into a grim, cold tone. "Less than you might think. At least for her. Personally." Thankfully, Senator Darsana seemed to sense his misstep. His hands spread to the sides, his head dipping slightly, a soft, brief tone almost like a keen slipping past his lips. "I assume convenient is another not entirely accurate word. There was nothing convenient about her brother's death, or about the years of experience she'd brought with her from living under the Empire. Not from her perspective. They'd been painful and hard-earned, to say nothing of what she had lost, what it had cost to bring her here." "Yes," Leia answered, letting her gaze slide up to a corner where she knew a security camera was located, then back to Senator Darsana. "I've worked hard to get here, Senator. I've taken advantage of the situation I've been given, to the extent I can. I've been pleased with the results of most of my efforts, and confused and distracted by others. But please don't misunderstand. I'm not here because I want to be. If she had a choice, any choice she would pick, what would she pick? Could she leave all this behind? Senator Dasana? Padme? Shmi? Anakin? There was a pause as the senator considered her words. Then he nodded. I'm concerned with the recommendation Senator Sadashasa has presented. Not because the concept is without merit, but because I do not think she has fully thought through the implications of her recommendations. Government control of the acquired droid parts? Leia asked. Or probability of profiting the Hutts? Benefits to industrial and trading planets? Likelihood of these traders warmongering? His hands fluttered as he let out what seemed like a pleased sigh. Oh. You do know how to get to the heart of an issue. Plenty of practice, Leia said, standing. Why don't you take me to lunch? You can invite Shay and talk over some of your ideas for countering those problems. You assume I have any, he said, but didn't make any protest to her demand for lunch. I assume nothing, Leia laughed. You're the one that came to my office. He bowed her out as his only reply. On Radnor, the heat was a living thing. It pressed against Obi-Wan Kenobi's skin, crawled into his robes, settled in his bones like an unwelcome guest. He muttered something under his breath that he hoped the Force wouldn't carry too far. Cody snorted beside him. You don't say, sir! The armor had to make it worse. Obi-Wan knew they wanted him in some. He'd conceded to try pieces of it. They were waiting for Anakin to bring the rest back with him. General Skywalker. In spite of the heat, Obi-Wan shivered slightly. It took a moment, the scrutiny of a long stare, before Cody said, He'll be all right. The 501st is staying with us for now. You'll have plenty of time to finish getting him trained up, and we'll help. It wasn't that. Obi-Wan stared out over the orange and white landscape, squinting against the glare. They don't teach us how to train them. He didn't say the rest, or how to let them go. And no one trained us for this. Cody's voice was level, matter of fact. But the admission stung given how much trust his men had offered him. Obi-Wan swallowed around the fear, the certainty that he wasn't enough. He was making this up as he went. All of them were. And it had been easy so far, he knew. They'd been on the edge of conflict, not in the middle of it. Christophsis had been a nightmare if Master Windu's terse, limited explanations were anything to go by. To say nothing of the disaster that was still unfolding on Ryloth. Reports were delayed, information sketchy at best, but it was going to be a long, bloody campaign to take that system back. And if Anakin did succeed here, what were the odds he'd be sent there next? Leia did, Cody said. The observation cut through the haze, the disdain as sharp as ever. Makes you wonder who taught her. Experience, I would expect, Obi-Wan said slowly, watching the horizon to avoid the irritation he could feel from Cody. And she certainly did the best she could with us. But I wouldn't call it anything as formal as training. There was another pause before Cody asked the question that had been building between them for weeks. Sir, why do you trust her so much? It wasn't the first time the commander had asked, but Obi-Wan could feel something different in the question this time. An almost desperate search for reassurance, maybe. Exposure seemed to have worsened Cody's view of Leia, not improved it. But to answer, darkness. Not in his eyes. All around him. Pressing against his mind, seeping into his heart, his failures spinning through memory. His inadequacies. The promise of power, if he would just let go. You didn't give up. He still couldn't grasp how she'd known. Leia wasn't a Jedi, wasn't trained in the Force in any appreciable way. Falling wasn't something that should have occurred to her, shouldn't have presented itself as an option for what had been Obi-Wan's greatest fear. But she'd seen it, exposed it, without being distracted by anything else. As if she'd known in her bones what it was like to fight that kind of darkness. How crucial it was that in the face of it, they hadn't given up. Even his mind healer hadn't managed to grasp it. They'd talked about the torture, the feelings of inadequacy and hopelessness from being imprisoned, weak, paralyzed by pain and exhaustion. The fear during the escape. How he'd worried that this almost stranger and his Padawan would also be captured, that they might be hurt or killed. But they'd never discussed how close Obi-Wan had come to reaching out with his anger, his pain, his desperation, scrambling for power, enough power to flee, to escape, to kill. Viscerally, Leia had known. Tilting his head back and shielding his eyes with his hand, all he could say was, "I understand her. I don't agree with everything she does, with the risks she's willing to take. But I understand being desperate, wanting to protect something so badly you stop seeing the consequences as you decide what actions to take." Cody huffed. "Not a problem you have, sir." Obi-Wan chuckled. "Oh, you just missed the worst of it. You should have seen me when I started training Anakin. I didn't have a clue what I was doing, and gone." He couldn't finish that thought, couldn't remember if Cody knew who Obi-Wan's master had been. "I couldn't fail them. I couldn't imagine the consequences." He shook his head. "You're lucky you missed that." Their break was over. Gregor was coming with the last patrol reports, and Obi-Wan wasn't going to waste a chance to read those inside, where it was moderately cool. "You're doing well," Cody said, before Gregor had quite reached them. Obi-Wan started a little. "However bad it was then, you take care of us. You keep your eyes open." And then, with a grin, "Just let us watch your back. We'll let you know if you pick up any bad habits." "Oh," Obi-Wan grinned back. "I have every confidence of that." Leia woke with a gasp, panting for breath, trying to push the after-images of the dream aside. She clung to the reality around her. The cool sheets, the hum of Coruscant's endless night traffic, the distant pulse of the apartment's climate controls. She should have expected to dream about them dying tonight. It had been a while. She was due. Checking the time, Leia resigned herself. She struggled out of the covers, threw her legs over the side of the bed, and wobbled to uprightness, still fighting to see the room in front of her instead of the fire that danced behind her eyes. When the blurriness had moved mostly to the edges of her vision, she headed to the kitchen to prepare some tea. Or rather, extremely early. She'd need to put something on closer to dawn as well, to hide how long she'd been up. Luke, who'd been curled close in the back of her mind offering comfort, stirred when Shmi came in, a fond and exasperated look on her grandmother's face. "It's to help me sleep," Leia lied, pointing defensively at the tea. "It's never to help you sleep," Shmi countered, coming over and wrapping Leia in a hug. "This time it could be," Leia mumbled into Shmi's shoulder. "Always have to have the last word," Luke said. But she could feel the grief behind his laughter. "Absolutely," Leia shot back, and knew her own teasing didn't hide her conflicted emotions. It was Shmi who finished making them tea. Leia, who fetched the blanket so they could sip it out on the balcony, watching the blurred lights of traffic moving above and around them. The hazy image was a fuzzy wrap around reality, glowing white and gold. Harsh but softer than the fire, Shmi gave Leia a few minutes of silence. But eventually she asked, "An old dream or a new one?" "Old," Leia answered. "Old and familiar." She considered before she added, "I dream about them dying." There was a brush in the Force from Shmi, seeking something. Then her grandmother asked, "Them?" "My family," Leia said, the words aching as she forced them out. If Shay knew, there was no justification for keeping Shmi out. "My brother, our friends." A moment to gather her courage. My fiancé." There was a flutter of something like understanding before Shmi said, "I'm so sorry." And then, when Leia said nothing, seeing something like that is almost impossible to forget. "It was such a telling." Response that Leia forgot to correct the assumption. Sorrow for her grandmother. Empathy. Reaching out even as Leia leaned into Shmi's side, whispering, I'm sorry too. I expected it to get easier, Shmi said, contemplating the steam rising from her cup. Something simmered at the edge of Leia's senses. What time cannot heal, it can numb, or push aside. Then she confessed, I did not expect to get angry again. It slipped out for a moment, a bitterness deeply entwined with regret, resentment, and guilt. It would have been confusing except that Leia knew that exact combination so personally and acutely she couldn't help but share the moment, seeping understanding into the Force and surprising Shmi. You didn't know about the Force, Leia said, meeting Shmi's wide eyes. You thought there was nothing you could do, so you accepted it. But there was. It was fallible logic. Leia had had no control of the Force when she was on the Death Star, and killing Tarkin once he'd given the order, once she'd already fallen for his trap, would have been pointless, satisfying, but ineffective. Maybe the Force could have revealed the lie. Maybe she could have tried an escape, or Vader could have realized what she was, or all of the what-ifs in the galaxy didn't change what had actually happened. That she hadn't known, that even if Vader had told her in that cell, she couldn't have stopped it. Could she? Some days Leia could accept that. Some days she blamed her parents. Other days Leia looked into a mirror and saw power in her eyes and knew it had been there all along. That something inside her had known it. That knowledge had helped her not be afraid. But it hadn't saved them. If I had known, Shmi let each word drop off her tongue with care and precision. Leia shuddered even under her blanket. Could I have saved them? It took all of Leia's willpower to make her lips move, to let that agonizing, cruel maybe slip into reality, to exist between them, caught in the steam from their cups, hovering and burning against the cool of the night. Or maybe the burning was inside her. Inside both of them, beneath the veneers of calm and quiet, of peace and control. Maybe they were both burning like twin suns. Mine, Leia thought. She's mine. A belonging that went both ways, Shmi to Leia, Leia to Shmi, home. Family, comfort, rage. Shmi's eyes slipped closed, her breath slowing to a meditative tempo. For a while the burning persisted, then it faded, slipped back under skin and muscle to settle, tingling in Leia's bones. I suppose, Shmi said, her eyes still shut, I should not be surprised that I am still angry. It surprises me, Leia admitted, hiding her gaze in her cup. Not just that I'm angry, but how real and present it feels. How it comes out of nowhere, how it lingers and stains. Oni always said, Shmi half choked on the words, that we had to do everything we could. I tried to teach him to be kind, to love people, even when many are cruel and wretched. But I didn't feel I really lived it until I realized how closely he was watching. Like I never pushed myself far enough until there was someone to keep me accountable. She looked out over the city. It's frustrating to know that was true. I seriously doubt that, Leia said, more with desperation than conviction. I refuse to believe that I wasn't trying hard enough just because I didn't stumble into a power I didn't know about, and I would never believe that of you. Leia had withstood Vader. She'd gotten back up after Alderaan's dust had gone cold and escaped with Luke and R2. She'd never stopped fighting, doing her best, even when she knew what horrors awaited her. You did everything you could, Leia promised, everything you could reasonably do, and probably some unreasonable things too. When Shmi smiled, it held all the warmth and comfort Luke's once had. All the hope and belief and passion crammed into that tiniest of gestures. Oh, definitely some unreasonable ones. Now you know where I get it, Leia smiled, ignoring the lurch in her heart as Shmi laughed. Be brave. And don't look back. But the voice was fading, becoming someone else's. The girl standing beside Anakin was small. Too small. In Obi-Wan's estimation, for the weight of the saber clipped to her hip or the Padawan braid wound through her montrals. She couldn't have been more than 14, and she was looking up at him with an expression that tried very hard to be solemn and mostly managed to be nervous. The council said, what? Obi-Wan repeated, because he needed to hear it again. Surely he had misheard. Surely there was some other explanation for why a child had been deposited on his doorstep in the middle of an active deployment. Anakin's jaw tightened. They said Ahsoka was qualified for apprenticeship, and it wasn't reasonable to make her wait until enough field Jedi had the free time to sort through the younglings and drag her out. A grin cracked through the frustration. Master Yoda put it much more diplomatically than that, but that was the gist. "And she is qualified," Anakin added, earnestness flooding his voice. "We practiced meditation and saber forms on the transport. Went over her studies. She knows what she's doing. And she's a decent pilot, too." The Togruta shot Anakin an offended look that made Obi-Wan want to laugh. She had no idea what a compliment decent was, coming from Anakin. Not pretty decent, not almost decent, not, gods forbid, technically airborne. Obi-Wan tried very hard not to remember that particular flight. "Master Yoda made the assignment?" he asked. "Committee, I think." Anakin shrugged. "Ahsoka's not the only one being sent out. Master Gallia drew the line at anyone younger than the oldest of the brothers, which I think was a mess to sort out between galactic standard age and species differences. Master Mundi didn't seem too happy about it. Or maybe he wasn't happy when people started arguing with him over technicalities. I wasn't really paying attention." The girl was amused by the rambling, Obi-Wan noted. But she was still nervous, her gaze flicking between them like a trapped bird scanning for exits. Obi-Wan hadn't brought himself to do formal introductions yet. That would make it final. Captain Rex was watching the whole exchange with narrowed eyes and a tight smile. Amused, Obi-Wan guessed, but also uncomfortable. She was a child. They were handing him a child. "She's not the only one?" Obi-Wan asked, dropping his voice even though he knew she could hear him. "They're assigning other Padawans." A grim cast settled over Anakin's features. "Yes. We know of at least 10 of them." There weren't words bad enough for what Obi-Wan was feeling. He scrubbed his face with one hand. He needed a drink, and probably a nap. But definitely the drink. "Obi-Wan Kenobi," he said at last, forcing himself to face her. He bowed slightly. "Currently, General of the 212th Battalion. Commander Cody, my second, is overseeing training right now. This is Captain Rex of the 501st. He turned to Anakin. "I'm told you got promoted." He watched Anakin make a face so reminiscent of Leia's beleaguered expression, it was almost frightening. "Taking over the 501st, Anakin confirmed. "Though you're still in charge as long as we're here." Greed, pure and simple, had Obi-Wan hoping that would be for as long as possible. "And you'll set a good example for my new Padawan," Obi-Wan said. "And always follow my orders?" "Oh, don't worry." Anakin had the audacity to wink at the girl. "I'll teach her everything she needs to know. Right, Ahsoka?" Ahsoka smiled at Anakin but glanced at Obi-Wan. "I know how to follow instructions." She bowed. "Thank you for taking me under your tutelage, Master." It felt wrong. Almost the same way Master had felt wrong when Anakin had first become his Padawan. Obi-Wan would have thought he'd be used to it by now. Maybe not. "I know Anakin has already put you through your paces," Obi-Wan said, "but I have some time this afternoon. We should probably go over where you are in your training and what your focus will be, especially while we're assigned here." "Yes, Master," Ahsoka agreed. Even without Anakin's almost flinch in the Force, Obi-Wan felt uneasy. He'd heard that word for years from Anakin. So why did it land differently now? "Don't worry too much about formalities," he found himself saying. "It's always good to be polite, but you're not training for diplomatic service." "I trained him out of that one," Anakin half whispered to her. "Don't worry." It earned a giggle. She was so young. Yeah. Obi-Wan made sure he was smiling when she looked at him again to show he wasn't offended, that Anakin hadn't bothered him, that she was allowed to be funny. Ahsoka had been raised in the temple, had grown up expecting to be a Jedi. So why was Obi-Wan just as nervous as he'd been with Anakin? One of the things Leia hadn't had much of an opinion on when she'd been dropped into Shmi's care was seafood. Alderaan had been mountainous, And while her position had meant plenty of opportunities to try various dishes, her palate was hardly sophisticated enough to discern good from bad. To say nothing of her years in the rebellion, where rations had been the great equalizer. Then she'd lived on Naboo and befriended Senator Darsana. There was no one on Coruscant she trusted more for expanding her tastes. Quality seafood on this planet was a trial. Plenty of options were imported, but they were expensive, and Leia had seen enough freight moving across the galaxy to be naturally suspicious of anything she put in her mouth. "You're pleased," Senator Darsana commented, as Leia snuck another bite while Shay was talking. Leia nodded, ignoring the slight pout on Shay's face. "It's delicious." Raw fish was always risky, but the senator had clearly gone to lengths to make sure the selection and sides were suited for human consumption. Saltier than anything she'd had on Naboo, but not unpleasantly so. Not that she'd have complained if it was. Leia had known how to eat anything long before she'd lived off military rations. "While I'm glad the two of you are enjoying yourselves," Shia said, leaning back, "what exactly was the purpose of meeting here today?" Leia was about to mention the droids when Senator Darsana said, "It was the easiest." Way to get her away from work for a moment, I took advantage. Even knowing her mouth was hanging open, even knowing her eyes were wide, Leia still couldn't bring herself to make a snappy retort. Not even in the face of Shaya's shock and Senator Darsana's smug grin. Luke was laughing, almost crying, in the back of her head. "You did not," Leia protested. "Why?" There was a warmth and kindness that always slipped in and out of focus when she was with Senator Darsana. He wasn't openly affectionate, exactly. Rather, his amusement ebbed and flowed with dry humor and optimistic cynicism, and Leia followed those currents because they were safe and familiar and not hostile. She trusted him. Enough that she hadn't questioned his motives for accepting her invitation, even when it had almost been rude. It was Shia's tut that brought Leia back to the moment, horrified that she might be blushing. "You know he's going to be insufferable about this now," Shay pointed out. And he was already bad enough. "I'd be more than happy to discuss work matters after we finished eating," Senator Darsana said, completely unruffled, though he did flick his fingers in a way Leia knew was dismissive. "But I did hope to distract you for a moment. I'm not certain you've taken a break since I came to see you on Naboo." And his gaze slid from his plate to her, suddenly hyper-focused. "I was hoping for a more accurate telling of what happened on Radnor." Her most innocent, wide-eyed stare would only get her in trouble, but Leia had to actively fight it. "What makes you think anything notable happened on Radnor? Besides you returning with Anakin Skywalker as an escort?" Senator Darsana's sibilance grew more pronounced even as his voice softened. "The fact that you won't talk about it, even to Senator Amidala." "I've spoken to her about my time there," Leia said, relaxing into the most casual posture she could manage. And Anakin was returning to Coruscant for his knighting. It was convenient. Shia was looking between them, sipping her drink instead of saying anything, and Leia wondered at that tactic. "I do have some contacts at the temple, you know," Senator Darsana said. "Oh, lovely. Just what Leia needed. More well-intentioned spies." "He gave a report on what happened on Radnor," Senator Darsana said, and Leia almost went blind with rage. Of course, there were leaks from the temple to the Senate. Of course, she should have considered that. Of course, Anakin wasn't the only person who could be coaxed into revealing a little too much at just the right time. "What did he say?" Leia sighed, snagging another bite. "My contacts do have some sense of professionalism." Senator Darsana was having almost no trouble reading her, and Leia honestly felt lost. Comforted, because it was a relief to be seen sometimes, but baffled. When had they spent enough time together that he'd come to understand her concerns so personally? They simply suggested that it was fortunate you weren't caught up in any of the violence while you were there, and that you had returned safely. If she ever found out who was passing that around, she was going to strangle them. "There was combat on the planet while I was there," Leia said, "but General Kenobi and Commander Skywalker had it under control." Senator Darsana did not ignore Shaya's twitch at Obi-Wan's name. "The bastard." "And how is General Kenobi?" Were you able to have a pleasant visit with him? He's as pretentious and smooth as ever, Leia offered, almost sorry as she nearly choked on her drink. I didn't think you knew him, not personally, but I knew his teacher a little. Senator Darsana smiled, seeing that he had Leia's full attention. And his teacher's teacher. That was too pointed. You didn't mention this before. It didn't seem like a good time. Senator Darsana added, the room is not only private, but secure. I do know how to check these things. This time Leia did let her eyes go too wide. Really? Amazing. He laughed, and she was proud of herself. She had noticed when the door closed how the air in the room had changed. Had almost missed the slight buzz of a scrambler, more because it was too familiar than anything, and she'd certainly noted how well known the senator was here, how promptly and quietly his needs had been met. I'm very curious where you learned that, Senator Darsana replied, but more interested in your impression of Yan Dooku. Considering the matter, I have a hard time seeing him as a Sith, by my understanding of them. Self-righteous and authoritative, certainly. He waved his hands in a way that she knew was offering a past impression of Dooku, but he seemed too rigid to grasp at anything so chaotic. Leia tapped her glass, ordering her words. Rigid people break under the right application of pressure. Sometimes it's the only way they can deal with realizing they aren't in control. He told you this? Or you saw it? More saw it, Leia conceded. So my conclusions may be off. But between what I saw and what Obi-Wan described from their time together, she scrambled, not wanting to reveal anything that would put her friend at a disadvantage while needing credibility. Dooku felt that he couldn't control the Order or the Republic, but the Sith could. He carried himself as if he were composed, but it was like a veneer. I could feel, just under the surface, he was spiraling. Fascinating, Senator Darsana murmured. When did this happen? Shay asked. When she was stealing all of the factory data from the Separatists, Senator Darsana answered, gleeful at knowing something she didn't. Technically, we were there to rescue Obi-Wan, Leia said. I just happened to grab some information on the way out. She watched Shay mouth the words "just happened" as Senator Darsana snorted. So you faced Count Dooku, Shay said, pressing her knuckles into her forehead. And that's how you found out he was a Sith. He wasn't terribly subtle about it, but we made it out alive. You are, Shay said, the most ridiculous person I have ever met. Why would you get involved with Jedi business like this? It's not just unsafe, it's practically suicidal. For the rest of her life, Leia would remember that Senator Darsana was a very dangerous and clever man who knew exactly how to put pressure on someone. If she didn't trust these people, she would be in serious danger right now. Because she did trust them, they were safe. It's risky, Leia agreed, but I'd hardly call it suicidal. You are the only one stupid enough to think that. Please. Leia couldn't help but laugh. What Han was doing was much more dangerous. Everything froze. It wasn't just the surprise and curiosity pooling off Shay and Senator Darsana. It was Leia realizing she had said his name, out loud, to people who had the resources to try and make use of it. And the motivation. Leia eyed her drink, trying to probe at it to see if it felt off, testing the contours of her mind to make sure she hadn't been compromised. No! This is on you! Luke offered sympathy, but no escape. I would have warned you if something like that was wrong, which was interesting, something she would remember for the future, but not helpful right now. Who is Han? Senator Darsana asked, calm and polite and as unthreatening as she'd ever seen him. He was a friend, Leia felt her mouth say, everything around her still slow and numb. He was a good friend. She felt Shay retreating, looking sorry but still curious. Senator Darsana didn't retreat in any way, but he didn't push either. Not more than, you feel that he was doing more risky things than you were? Well, he was dead. It wasn't funny, so why did she want to laugh? And Chewie was dead too. But so was Luke. Luke, who had tried being a Jedi and doing a Jedi's job while Leia had sat back and played politics and watched the galaxy spiral apart into something worse than nothingness. Maybe it was suicidal. Maybe all of this was, and ignoring that was the only way she kept getting away with it. But none of that was something she could tell these people. He wasn't force-sensitive, but I am, Leia shrugged. It's different. There was a hum from Senator Darsana and a concerning amount of surprise from Shay. Since when? She demanded. Since I was born, Leia drawled. This was how Han hid. It didn't always hide the lie, but it pushed them away. I didn't always know, though. That's still sort of new. Sort of new? Senator Darsana repeated. You discovered it when you came here? This was not a line of questioning Leia wanted to encourage or could afford to answer plainly. If she gave them a hard timeline, it would definitely come back to haunt her. No, before I got here. Within the last few years. It didn't matter as much until I got here, though. It's not something other people tend to notice if you aren't trained to use it, including Sith Lords who were digging around in your head, apparently. But she wasn't still bitter about that. Luke sighed. I see, Senator Darsana said, glancing over to Shay. Well, at least we can take comfort in knowing that you are not powerless. Never again. Blue and white and a green bolt and nothing. No, she agreed, feeling starting to burn through the tips of her fingers. I am not powerless. It was a moment before either of them responded. When they did, she was surprised to hear Senator Darsana say, in a rather droll tone, I'm told that those who are too rigid are more likely to break under pressure. He raised his glass to her. I wonder which you will end up being. Leia knew there was no safe answer to that. In a move that completely lacked subtlety, Shea told Senator Darsana that she and Leia would be heading to a nearby garden for a walk. He accepted the rebuff graciously, but there was a twinkle in his eye and the hint of a grin as he looked to Leia before he left them. This was not what Leia had anticipated. Come on, Shay said, looping her arm through Leia's before Leia could think to run, which she wouldn't have, probably. There's a nice place nearby. Nothing as fancy as they have on Naboo, I'm sure, but I like it. They couldn't get to the garden on foot, but once they were inside the dome, a multitude of walking paths wound between artfully placed trees that circled. A pond with a fountain in the center. The noise from outside had dropped off considerably, making it possible to catch the leaves rustling in the occasional artificial breeze or the sound of water tumbling. They even had a few birds, although Leia was dubious as to whether those were mechanical. Their perches seemed almost too aesthetically perfect. It's very nice, Leia said as they started along the widest looping path, noting a few other guests and paying attention to whose gaze lingered on her and Shay. It was impossible to know if anyone was tracking their conversation. Outdoors tended to be safer, but an enclosed walkway littered with political attachés and so near the Senate. Well, Leia did have a reputation for being paranoid. With good reason. Why didn't you tell me? Shay didn't waste time, which was a relief, and a problem. Tell you what? Leia asked, not sure what bothered Shia the most. It was no surprise when Shia said, Geonosis. You never said anything to me about what happened there. I've avoided telling most people, Leia agreed. I wouldn't have even told Padme if I could have. She managed to startle Shay. Not even, but Senator Darsana knows. He has a knack, Leia said, watching the path of a bird and trying to see if it was too neat, for catching me off guard. It wasn't my intention to keep him more informed than anyone else. It was impossible to miss the jealousy pouring off Shay, but Leia politely ignored it. It's just surprising, the senator said. Since you play things so close to the vest. They paused as their path brought them within range of another group. Leia thought she recognized Senator Clovis and had to repress a grimace. She made sure not to be facing him when he looked up. He surprises me too, Leia admitted once they were far enough away. I don't know that I can explain how much, but I think he's used to being more careful with what he sees and not making assumptions, and sometimes it's easier across species. Leia added, heart aching a bit as she thought of Chewie. You're less likely to confuse signals because you aren't familiar with them, especially if you don't use them personally. You pay less attention to words and more to body language. It was something she should have noticed sooner. It wasn't just an issue of species. She was responding to Mon, to Senator Organa, even to Palpatine as though she already knew their language. But this was before the Empire.